Uh, Welcome, colleagues, welcome, friends, to this very important and interesting, hopefully interesting discussion on climate negotiations and what does it mean? We'll come to that. We've got a wonderful set of panelists with us. We've got students who are part of the workshop today. We've got students from NAST. We've got students from Fatma Jinnah here and Rawalpindi. We appreciate their participation. We've got individuals who represent the civil society and academics. So we look forward to having this discussion and look forward to your questions as we move forward. This is our 23rd Sustainable Development Conference, but the very first one that we're doing completely online due to COVID. So if there was a silver lining to this, and there are very few, it is that perhaps it has fostered the use of technology in such a way that we can bring together individuals from various parts. SDC is known for bringing individuals from various parts, but then there are visa issues, there are transportation issues, but when we've got technology at our disposal, then everything else becomes moot. I'm not going to get into long introductions of the panelists here. They've achieved so much in their lives, and you can Google each one of them. So I'll come to them with a question, but let me just briefly tell you who they are. The chair of the panel is Ambassador Shafqat Kakakhel. He's the chairperson of the Board of Governors of SDPI, a renowned diplomat, a renowned environmentalist who's been working on climate change and water-related issues. Next, we've got Sobiah Becker, who is with the FCDO, the erstwhile DFID, and she works with the UNDP as well. And she'll talk about some of the things that we're doing in preparation for the Glasgow summit. We've got Harjeet Singh Saab from ActionAid, based in New Delhi. Again, somebody who's got a very deep understanding of the climate impacts on human beings, and he is an advocate for the most vulnerable amongst us. And last but not the very least, we've got Hassan Sipra, who is a young environmentalist, an academic, climatologist, who's here with us, and he'll talk about some of the things that he's been working on in recent years. We're also to be joined by Dr. Adil Najam from Boston University. I know there are some internet issues going around, and so hopefully he'll find his way here and join the discussion. But let me start by asking my fellow panelists here about their climate journeys. We're talking about climate change here, and we've got a number of young students, and they'd like to learn more from you about who you are as a person and what brings you, what motivates you to be a part of this debate on climate and water and environment. And so I'm going to come to each one of you to kindly touch upon that before we move on to the meatier things in this discussion. So Sobiah, if I may please start with you. Kindly tell us about your climate journey.
Well, first of all, I would like to wish everyone a very good evening and Assalamu alaikum. And thank you also for the very warm welcome. I'm indeed very pleased to be here, and I look forward to many such interactions in the future. My name is Sobiah Becker, and I am the Climate Change Advisor to the FCDO, formerly known as DFID, as well as the Climate Change Advisor to the UNDP in Pakistan. So, Imran, I think that I don't want to bore people with my career path, but for those who are interested, they can always look up my LinkedIn profile. So, you asked what brings me here. I would say a set of happy coincidences when I started working in the renewable energy and the energy efficiency sector. And the next logical step, and this is about 14 years ago now, and the next logical step for my career was then to deepen my qualifications as well as experience in climate change, because working in the renewable energy and energy efficiency sector gave me the first experiences with climate change. The carbon development mechanism was coming out, and there was a great deal of interest on the part of industrialists here in Pakistan on how they could enter the carbon market, and so you see there's a natural nexus there. But what the more interesting part of how I understand your question is not what got me here, but what keeps me here. What drives me every single day, because you know, I know, and I'm sure everyone in the audience knows that the fight against climate change is an uphill battle. So, what drives me? We have a beautiful world, and I would actually, we had a beautiful world, and I lay emphasis on the word had because this planet Earth had a great deal of flora and fauna and animal species, and we alone are responsible for this destruction of this flora and fauna and animal species, which some very reliable estimates put down to having at least a 50% extinction rate. And this is largely because of the way that we live, how we eat, and how we conduct our daily business. So it's in every aspect of our lives. And we are fast getting to a world where it will be pretty much impossible for us to survive. And I'm not even talking about this being a distant reality. I mean, just look at the COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic is a classic case of the ecosystem being exploited to a point where zoonosis, such as the COVID-19 virus, it turns into pandemics. And this is not the first pandemic. It certainly won't be the last pandemic. So, what are we going today to make the world a better place tomorrow? And this is my journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sobiah, for talking about that and highlighting what makes you take when it comes to these issues. May I please move now to Harjeet and ask him the same question and have him reflect on that. Thank you.
Sure. So yeah, it's quite a story how I landed up in the climate space. In fact, even in the social sector, I don't come from any educational background in the social sector. In fact, I have done management and marketing. It's just that my institute was doing quite a bit of work in rural development, and that's why I got interested. I kind of dumped marketing and immediately joined the social sector. Started working at the grassroots and joined an organization to help in fundraising because of my marketing background. But then I got into ActionAid, where I was much more deeply involved in the development issues, and that's where I would call ActionAid as my school, as my college and university. In fact, I'm running 19th year into ActionAid at this moment, and I've learned a great deal from this organization. So specifically, how I got into climate space. In fact, after tsunami, I was in Andaman Nicobar Islands doing the tsunami response program. I was based there for 2.5 years. Then I became the policy person. And that's how I could see the connection between how disasters are happening, who is responsible, who gets more affected with these disasters. And then from there, although tsunami was not an environmental disaster of sorts, but the connection of how people become vulnerable was very much there when we could see the climatic disasters increasing. So in 2007, I got into the climate work and I started doing research and got into policy space. And in between, I was also the emergency advisor for Asia and Americas, but I could continue to connect with the climate space. So I've been working and following negotiations since 2008 and realized that in that space, again, the whole arena was occupied much more by developed countries and their narratives. It wasn't easy for developing countries to talk about poor people. And that's exactly the reason, Imran, if you see why the whole climate debate is structured much more around mitigation. because developing countries and development practitioners came much late in the game, and then they started driving the conversation. And I think that's where I felt, personally, because I had seen climatic impacts, and also as ActionAid that works with poor and excluded people. So it became a responsibility on our part to represent their voice and even bring their voices. We often take community members to these international negotiations. And why we go to these negotiations? Because climate change is a matter of global injustice. Yes, there are local factors. We need to protect environment. As Sobiah is saying, we ourselves are responsible for a lot of damage. But the current climate crisis is not because of developing countries, but elites and rich nations who have caused the problem. That's why it's really important to go to that space. And that's how I connect my work. So I started as a practitioner and reached that space much more to look at the source of the problem.
Thank you for that, Harjeet. It's a really quite a journey that you have there. Moving on to Hassaan.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much to SDPI for hosting, and for 23 years now, this conference, which I think it's a very important place to sort of facilitate dialogue, particularly for Pakistan and the region in terms of the connectivity it provides. It's also a very wonderful question to start off with. It's a nice warm up for the sort of discussion I hope we'll get into. For me, I didn't know anything about climate or environment until I was in my bachelor's. I was in my second year in the US, and I was really just frustrated. I recall sitting at the campus cafeteria and just looking at the food waste that was going by and thinking, that's got to be a problem. And somehow stumbled through an introduction into the office of the head of the environmental sciences department. And I just sort of unloaded on him that, hey, this is a problem. What can be done about it? And he said, oh, what you want to do actually is do an environmental audit. And I've got $3,000 grant that I've been trying to get rid of for the past 3 years, and nobody seems to want to take it. Do you want it? So I heard $3,000 and I was like, oh, yes, I'll do this. And the catch was that I had to take 2 courses on environmental science. And I had gone in thinking I would do economics and political science, which, all of a sudden, all that went out the door. And here I was all of a sudden transitioning towards an environmental science major. And that sort of started what is now become a climate journey for me. And here I want to actually, for all the young students particularly listening in, I want to highlight 2 things. One, there's a distinction now between climate and environment. They're very much related and interlinked, and a lot of people with environmental backgrounds end up in the climate field. But they are distinct as well, because climate change, unlike the environment's a localized issue. While climate change covers all levels, it goes from the global issues to the sort of rich-poor dynamic that Harjeet talked about, to the negotiations and all sorts of those things. And it then has impacts at the local level. So the second thing I want to bring to particularly students' attentions is how you can make your journey towards anything that you're passionate about is to own your frustrations and to find problems that you can personally try and fix. That was the first thing that I did when I was at Westminster College and I got that $3,000. I spent a year looking at the energy consumption of the university, the water consumption, the food waste that was being generated. And that sort of got me going. And then eventually I just stumbled into lots of other problems that I thought that I could see in the world. And I thought, well, how can I personally try and make a difference here? And that's the core to solving any problem. And climate just happens to be an all-encompassing problem, because as Sobiah so beautifully said, the world is a gorgeous place. And even though we have lost a lot of it, with so much biodiversity lost, if you just keep your eyes open and look towards the experiences the world has to offer, there's still a lot that is of a saving grace, that has the potential for us to to continue to build upon, for us to adapt to, for us to mitigate, to try and save, all of those things. I think that's sort of the core lesson that I've taken from my much shorter journey than the other panelists here. But
Thank you.
that's
Thank
the
you,
lesson.
Hassan.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm sure your words are, they're going to resonate with the students that we have here and younger individuals who are trying to see, carve their own path. And this is going to be very helpful to them. I see that Dr. Adil Najam has joined us. So just in, at the right time, and hopefully he can share his climate journey with us and then talk about that. Dr. Najam?
Imran, thank you very much. My climate journey, there is this. I think I was pushed into it. I looked around. There was no one else, and there is where I was standing. So I don't know if it's a climate journey. My journey has just been a development journey. I think I came to this as a development person. I remain in it as a development person. I sometimes resist being called a climate person because I think that sometimes, not always, sometimes that can become more of a slogan than anything else, more of a fashion than anything else. I think people come to this from two directions. Many come to it from an ecological direction. And while I have stumbled and embraced the ecological direction, the real direction is people too. For me, people are the center of this. There were these sort of very, very central philosophical debates when I was starting on it about 30 years ago about anthropocentric and ecocentric. And I have never seen an environment without people. I have, for example, very often wondered about this argument that the planet is in danger. I'm quite convinced the planet is in no danger whatsoever. The planet is fine. The planet was always fine. The planet was fine before us. The planet will be fine after us. It might even be better after us. So to me, the challenge is a very simple one. There is this species. It's not a very smart species. I just happen to be part of that species. And one of the existential challenges for our species is the environmental challenge at large, which currently is being manifested quite centrally through the climate issue. And that's the other thing. So I started off as an engineer. Which was about sort of making hopefully the world a better place, and then stumbled into this notion that if we want to be looking at making people's lives better, if we want to be looking at the great challenges of our times, then we cannot ignore the ecological challenges and then the climate challenges. Very briefly, I won't take too long, just a minute. For many years, especially when I was doing my PhD, I resisted climate change like the plague. Everyone and their dog was going after climate change because that was the big fashionable thing to do. And I resisted it like anything, because I thought there were too many people, and I now think there are too many people and too little action. And so I was more interested in forests, and I was more interested in biodiversity, and I was more interested in water. And then what I realized was that the way the politics of climate was going, all of these things were being consumed. All the money was, all the donors were there, because that's where the fashionable crowd hung out. And I think I got totally sucked into it with the IPCC by first resisting the IPCC's over focus on the on the carbon molecule. So I came to the IPCC as a resistor, as an agitator, because it was too focused on the carbon molecule, on managing carbon. And arguing that climate has to be more than carbon. Carbon may be the cause, but what you're really focused on, interested in, is not carbon. You're interested in people's well-being, ecosystems' well-being, and that is what brought me into climate. And there is where I remain.
Thank you so much for these words, and thank you for saying that the planet is a lot more resilient. And the one example that I give is that of Chernobyl and what's happening around that. So many decades after that particular disaster, where the ecology and the natural environment around Chernobyl has begun to improve in such an impressive manner. So the Earth will recover no matter what we do to it. It's the humans that at the end of the day remain a major concern in a number of ways, as we'll talk about as we move forward. So thank you so much for joining us. So I've got a number of questions here, and hopefully we'll try and get through all of them, because it's very rare that we get to have so many different people, so many important people who've got such an important background to be here at such a forum. But let's talk about this past week. This is when we've been celebrating 5 years since the Paris Climate Agreement. Yet, as the UN conference from a couple of days ago suggested, that we're still talking about raising climate ambition. Wasn't Paris Agreement supposed to get us to that pathway? And why is it that we're still talking about climate ambition or lack thereof? So this is a question that I'll come to, with which I'll come to each one of you. But let's start with Sobiah and see if she can shed some light on this.
Thank you, Imran. And this is a very valid question, seeing as to how the Climate Ambition Summit just concluded on the 12th of December. And also that 2020 marks the beginning of the milestone of action leading up to 2030. So climate ambition is front and center right now. To put this question into perspective, I'm going to lean upon a quote, one of, I think, the most famous quotes from COP23, which is that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. So if you scale this to 46 years, then the human race has been on this planet for just 4 hours. And the Industrial Revolution, which is when climate change began, is 1 minute old. And in that time, 50% of the Earth's forests have been destroyed. We have almost 50% of species lost. So if you say, is something amiss? Do we need to talk about raising climate ambition? Yes, we do. The Paris Agreement framed the need for action on the part of the global community, but it is the individual actions that will cascade up to a bigger ambition, the sort of ambition that we need in order to have a better future for us and for future generations. So to me, climate ambition means 3 things. Number 1, it's about respecting as well as preserving the environment and all things in it. Number 2, it's about taking tangible steps to protect the climate. So really walking the talk, because we've had many years of just talk. This means reducing our carbon footprint. This means reducing our environmental footprint and living within our means. And number 3, acting responsibly so that we don't just repair, but we also regain what we have lost. So 2 days ago, the Paris Agreement turned 5, as you rightly pointed out. And it is sad that the global community has to be spurred on to increase ambition. We are still way off target. And under the current policy scenario, if things keep progressing, if we keep on this trajectory that we're on, global warming will be about 2.9 degrees centigrade higher in 2100. So if we take the nationally determined contributions that were first submitted in response to the ratification of the Paris Agreement, warming will still rise to about 2.7 degrees centigrade. So this conversation around global warming and national contributions cannot be around historical responsibility, but the conversation around climate ambition has to be more of a proactive one. This conversation has to be about building stronger, healthier, and safer societies in the face of the risks we face today as a result of our collective actions. And I'm sure Harjeet will have many more contributions in this regard, as he already alluded to in his opening statements. I'd like to add here that as the COP26 president, the UK has set very ambitious targets. It is looking to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 68% by 2030. The UK has set a goal of powering all households with offshore wind power by 2030. At the recent climate ambition, Prime Minister Imran Khan announced a moratorium on new coal, and which will hopefully encourage the shift to cleaner fuels in the long run. So the fact that Pakistan would like to grow the share of renewable energy to 20,000 megawatts by 2030, the moratorium on new coal-fired power plants, these and other such actions are great beginnings. But this country needs to do more. We need to do more. Pakistan needs to make significant investments that will put it on a clean green trajectory. And for these investments to be successful, it must create an enabling environment. And the nationally determined contributions provide just a framework, a cohesive framework for action in the country, because it identifies the different sectors where the greatest gains can be made in terms of mitigating um, uh, emissions, and it also provides a framework for putting into place the right adaptation actions, which in the long run will increase the social resilience. It will reduce the vulnerability, because you have a population here and you have a responsibility towards that population. And what actions are you going to put into place to ensure that these people have a decent quality of life? I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sobiah. Let me move now to Hassaan and try and get him to talk about global climate ambition as he sees it. So if you want to link it to Pakistan, that's fine as well. But
thank you, Imran. I have to say that we have to raise the ambition, but the way that we have been going about it, slow and steady as we are, is perhaps okay. We have to get to 2100 to 2.9 degrees warming already. That's where we're headed. And we would like to restrict it to 1.5 to 2 degrees. Getting to that level of ambition over the course of the next 15 years, from 2015 to 2030, is something that actually will require us to continually be raising that ambition. Our NDC's obligations all sort of have that mechanism built into them. So countries in 2015 came out with their first NDCs and they said, oh, we will try and get to this is what we can do right now. In 2020, it's the next phase of reporting. It's the next phase of raising that ambition. So countries have learned over the last 5 years what they need to do in order to make that next transition to their new commitments. There are certain developed countries, and particularly the European Union, that is far better equipped to make those ambitions clear. The clearest ambition that they've given now as part of the European New Green Deal is that they've raised the ambition to reduce their emissions by 40% to now by 65%. So that really clearly speaks to the mitigation aspects that the Europeans, for example, can do. The Americans now are again in a transition phase where with a Biden presidency, perhaps we'll see increasing ambition coming out from there as well. On the global scale, then you also have the Chinese, which have also set very clear targets under President Xi Jinping's ecological civilization for where they would like to be headed by 2030. Interestingly, within this, the IFC has now come out with with a new analysis that shows that the climate potential for investments in developing countries and in emerging economies in particular, which includes Pakistan, India, and many of the big developing countries, is now a $23 trillion investment, which is a massive amount to try and achieve in order to get to the level of climate mitigation and adaptation. So the ambition is a continual conversation that needs to be happening and that needs to be ratcheted up. That's the clear sort of argument that I can see for why the way that the Paris Agreement is structured and how it needs to flow forward all the way up to 2030. Within that, I also feel that keeping it between 1.5 to 2 degrees, as it was in Paris, it was a political decision. A 1.5 degree increase in temperature is going to have massive ramifications for the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, for example. The third pole, which feeds and gives water to and sustains 2 billion, a quarter of the world's population. So we have to try and account for this, all of this within the global thermostat to try and get to 1.5 to 2 degrees and make sure that we can do that in a long run fashion. For countries like Pakistan, where in between the time we had from 2015 to now, with the PTI government coming in and raising the ambition, setting up new institutions, really sort of guides, follows the guidance principles that are laid out within the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Hassaan, for giving us an overview of what the countries are doing across the world, where we're heading, and what needs to be done in your mind. Let me turn to Harjeet Bhai now. A friend of mine, a young climate reality leader, Anna Rathore, just said on the chat box that no, not 1.5, not 1.5 to 2, just 1.5, please. And this is the cry that we're hearing from the younger generation, that nothing more should be allowed to add to the greenhouse gases. What's your take on it?
I'll be very blunt. The reality is that even 1 degree temperature rise, and right now we are at 1.2, is a death sentence for millions of people. And it is easy for us to talk about 1.5 and 2, but if you look at the reality of people on ground, they're already suffering. Many islands are already sinking, and there are millions of people who are facing disasters, one after the other. Earlier, they were able to cope with the first one before they are hit by the other one, but now they don't even have that much time and capacity to recover from the previous one. And the one that's hitting them next is much harder and taking away all their resources and pushing them decades back. I think we are already in a very, very sad situation. Sad, but not surprising, the way negotiations have been going on since 1992. So what Hassaan said, yes, in the last few days and months, we have seen action, European Union coming forward, China, now with Biden, probably we'll see some action in the US. But the reality is we are 30 years late. We knew about climate science with certainty 50 years ago. All that data has been, Dr. Najam was talking about it. Climate has been talked about for a very long time. But the fact is we did not act. And why we did not act? Because of some powerful people. The reality is that in the last, if you look at the cumulative emissions, it's US and the EU that are responsible for more than 50% of emissions. And it's only 100 companies that are responsible for 71% of emissions. So there were some people, some countries and elites who were controlling the emissions, and they are the ones who are responsible, and they are the ones who were also funding science denialism. And that's why we have not seen any action, which caused so much of confusion. And all the good things that we are seeing in terms of renewable energy, that would have happened 30, 40 years ago. And why that was important, if you read the UNEP emission gap report, the previous one said, had we acted in the last 10 years, we would have had to reduce our emissions at the rate of 3.3%. to stay below 1.5. And you know what what percentage we have to do is almost double. Now the reductions have to be 7% per annum. At that rate, we have to reduce. So the fact is, inaction of the last just decade has doubled, has to double our ambition, and we are not on that track. So there's a lot that did not happen in the last 30 years. Yes, we can celebrate the action that we have seen, but it's not enough. And the reality is that we are already locked into a scenario of 1.5 and probably more, which is going to be devastating for millions of people, and particularly for this region, for our own countries, and for Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Nepal. We are going to be suffering a lot more. So, and all the action that you have seen is not because suddenly leaders decided to do something. It's the pressure that has come from citizens and young people and CSOs. I think that we need to realize that how the change has started over the last few years.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And you've highlighted how the window of opportunity in terms of coming even close to what the Paris agreement stipulated, that's closing really fast. And that brings me to Dr. Adil Najam, and I'm going to have him talk about this. Dr. Saab, you wrote an article some time back that was right before, after the Paris Agreement. You talked about how you were in a subway train going to the meeting, and what your thoughts were, because you have been to these meetings. You've been to conference of party after conference of party. You've been to a climate negotiation event after a climate negotiation event. So is this something that is working? How can we continue to negotiate the climate while it's having such a devastating impact on the community, the world?
Yeah, it's not working. It's not working. It's not working. It's a joke, and it is broken. And it ka matlab hai we are not working. Let's also be very clear. ये किसी और ने नहीं खराब किया, ये मैंने और आपने किया. We have broken this and we keep going with the slogans. So पहले तो I apologize for coming in late because I feel real bad because I was waiting for this and I had misunderstood the time in my mind. I apologize for that. Now I had thought कि Hassaan being the young man here would set the angry young tone. Lekin wo, because he hasn't, it's now left to Shafqat Saab and myself to be the young people on the panel. So let me say this. I thought then ke Harjeet, when he said ke he would be blunt, but he was so polite. I think Harjeet, you are too polite. Yaar, when you say ke now we are seeing action, kidhar dekh rahe hain? I don't see any action. All I see is statements. Kabhi England kehta hai we will do this. Ambition. मैं ambition को मैं चाटूंगा, मैं उसको क्या करूंगा? What am I going to do with this ambition? Can someone please show me some action? For 30 years, we keep promising, ab ye kar denge, now we will do this, now we will do this, now we will do this. For God's sake, main mar jaunga. And to Rathore, I am sorry. Was it Anam Rathore who asked about 1.5? Let me be the one to put it on record. There is no way in hell that you can do 1.5. Yeah, I'm a science person. You cannot do 1.5 at this point. To do 1.5, we will have to make the type of changes you are incapable of making. This is a lie. It was a lie at Paris. No one really believed in 1.5. The reason they said 1.5 was because without that, the small island states would not have come on board. And the poor small island states, wink, wink, got hoodwinked into it. At this point, it is a near mathematical impossibility. Saying you will do 1.5 is like saying that Pakistan will do 20% growth this year. 20% economic growth ho jaye, mujhe utha dijiyega. Jab 1.5 ho jaye, mujhe utha dijiyega. What are you doing apart from making statements ke we will not do this? Right? Whether it is the UK, whether it is Europe, they have let us down. And this is not about Pakistan and coal. This is about the UK. This is about the US. This is about Germany. This is about France. And certainly this is about the joke that is the United States, right? I know I'm getting emotional, but for God's sake, at some point, someone has to get emotional. Imran, yeah, you were saying that this is 5 years since Paris. I'll tell you what this is. This is 5 years since Paris. This is 6 years since Lima. This is 11 years since Copenhagen. This is 13 years since Bali. This is 23 years. This is 23 years since Kyoto. This is 25 years since Berlin. And I was at each one of those places, I'm sorry to say. And I'm really sorry to say, and I apologize to the planet, I think I have spent more carbon getting to these melas than these melas have helped us reduce. Now, again, I understand. Because I was late, I'm getting angry at myself and therefore becoming emotional at you. That is not the point. I'm saying if you are really serious about climate, then for God's sake, start taking it seriously. The climate negotiation game has not been a success. And it has become a game. It has become a thing. I talk to my friends. These are my friends. I love them. But they, in their calendar, have for next 5 years, it will be this COP and this COP and this COP. It has become a way of constant negotiation. Yet I was at Kyoto. We thought Kyoto was going to do something. And on the Paris Agreement, I wish it were a success. I wish it were a success. I am not a climate denier. I am the opposite. I am saying that we have a lack of ambition. We have substituted slogans for action. And it's been a quarter century that I've been doing this. I was at every COP from the first one until Copenhagen. At Copenhagen, I said, okay, done. Because that was the height of ambition. And essentially, all of us agreed we were more interested in making these annual junkets than we were interested in doing anything. And frankly, and I apologize, Shafqat Saab, I'm sorry, I'm too emotional today. But my apologies. I usually try not to be this. But I think what happened at Copenhagen, developing countries and developing country people and developing country scholars and developing country NGOs dropped not just the ball, they gave up. We became totally part of the system itself. Instead of pushing developing the industrialized countries where the emissions are, including the new industrialized countries, the Chinas, the Indias, etc., for reducing that carbon, we got into this game of, okay, there is a lot to be done here. There are jobs here. There is a whole system of negotiation. I do not think anyone had bad intention, but we became the system. There is a system of climate negotiation. And it is to the benefit of everyone in that system, me included, for the system to just keep going. How long should it take the planet to make an agreement? Yeah, this is 25 years since Berlin. I remember being at Berlin. The idea was in 2 years we would do the agreement and then we will start working. And eventually what we are celebrating is Paris, which has no commitment, which has no legal commitment whatsoever. It essentially says, tell us what you will do, and then we will cheer you for doing it if you do it, and if you don't do it, then nothing will happen. So for at some point, if you are a small island state, this 1.5 Nara, record this and please let me know when the 1.5 happen. I apologize. I really apologize. I promise not to be as emotional on your other answers, but I do think that we should get away from ambition and on to action. Please tell me what you have done, not what you will do.
No,
sorry.
This is, you don't need to apologize. I mean, this is something that's coming from the heart. I mean, there's students here, they want to hear this. They can learn about policies and plans, and they'll be in the field looking at those policies and plans until they're old enough, and they'll have their kids and they'll have their grandkids, and will still be in the same position. So it's very important that you bring that in. A couple of years back, Greta Thunberg was at the United Nations, and she got emotional, and people really went after her. I mean, it's okay to be emotional. It's okay to talk about this thing in an emotional way, because this reflects who we are as a human, as the human race, and where we're headed. So that's very important. Harjeet bhai, you want to add to what Dr. Najam has just said?
No, absolutely, and thank you so much for saying that. And if you see the way I criticize rich countries, you will find me exhibiting the same emotion. So I'm completely with you. But at the same time, I don't want young people to lose hope and say nothing is happening. And that's where I have a slight disagreement. I would say the advancement that has happened in technology, not at the COP, but because of the COP. Because
we've kind of lost you, Harjeet bhai. If I may request,
these COPs were always sending a signal that, we will be moving towards that. Yeah.
Yeah, if I may request you to kindly turn off your video, perhaps the audio will be better then. We kind of lost you there. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Can you hear me better?
Yes, please.
Is it better? So what I wanted to say, just to add to what Dr. Najam said, I think it's really important for us to reflect how we are so late and why this hasn't happened. I think we looked at climate negotiations as an environmental agenda. We did not recognize that it's not environment. It is much more about economics. It's much more about trade. And that was the reason it was not making any progress. Actually, and that's what they have been doing for the last 30 years, and not allowing negotiations to move forward, because they know that they will have to make deep cuts. And if you look at the data, the reality is since 1990s, and then the last data that they provided was of 2018, their emissions have increased by 3% compared to 1990 levels and not reduced. So Kyoto definitely did not work, as Dr. Nazam was pointed out. And we as developing countries have actually failed to even provide an alternative. We have always been saving our own so-called development space so that we can also follow the same American lifestyle. And I think that's where we have to take the blame. And we did not put our foot down in these negotiations and say we are going to block it like 25 years ago because we did not see any action. So I completely agree. The failure has been from all sides. Of course, rich countries were protecting their economies and their corporations, who, as I said, just 100 corporations are responsible for the crisis. And we kept sending our environmental ministers, and we all know who gets the environmental portfolio and who gets the finance portfolio, in our own governments. So we were actually, we had our weakest link in these negotiations, and that's why we have not made progress, and rich countries had their way. I think so. We definitely, as developing countries, also need to reflect what we contributed and where we should have put our foot down. So I'm totally in agreement with Dr. Nazam.
Thank you, Harjeet, for this. Let me now just go back. So we've talked about mitigation essentially, and we know where we're at. We're not doing well. I wanna the next round. I wanna go back to Dr. Adil Najam and start with him, and then come back to all of you. So there's a question about there's a pandemic going on, and there's so many other issues that are happening. Why pay attention to it? And then you've been talking about this being the age of adaptation, Dr. Najam, right? Yet, whenever we talk about our climate agenda, it's always mitigation. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, they had a report recently that only talked about mitigation, that only judged countries on mitigation activities, and on adaptation, we don't see much progress. Why is that when we are definitely in the age of adaptation?
Imran, my view has been that we are, and this is for the last 5 years, I've been writing and talking and advancing this idea that we are already in the age of adaptation. What does adaptation mean? What is adaptation? Adaptation is the failure of mitigation. Right? If you mitigate, then you won't have to adapt. The less you mitigate, the more you will have to adapt. And we are used to, as a species, we are very good at adaptation. I am wearing a sweater because it is cold. If it rains, I'll take an umbrella. That's adaptation. So in a way, to your question, I would say that we are adapting, and we will have to adapt. Adaptation will happen whether mitigation happens or not. The question is who takes the cost of adaptation, right? So every time a flood comes or a fire comes, people adapt to it. Adapt ka matlab ek to ye na ki you somehow deal with it. The other is your house burns. The other is your livelihood goes away. That is also a way of adaptation, unfortunately. So again, on the positive side, I think adaptation is where development is. Show me an adaptation project, any adaptation project in the world, and I will show you a development project. And I think that is where the developing country focus should be. The issue with mitigation, now this doesn't mean, adaptation does not mean that mitigation is not important, because as I said, adaptation equals failure of mitigation. So the less you mitigate, the more you have to adapt. The problem for the global problem is that Pakistan coal this or that is not going to make a difference in the mitigation curve of the world. But where countries like ourselves become frontline is where our people will have to adapt. And who will have to adapt? It is always the poorest person who has to adapt, right? That is a law of nature. When an earthquake comes, when a flood comes, when a fire comes, why is it that the poorest suffer more? Not because nature is against them, but because they have the least resources. I'll use the example of an earthquake, which is not about climate, of course, but it's a good example. No one in the world has ever died of an earthquake, right? People don't die because the earth shakes. People die because the roof falls on their head. Why does the roof fall on one person's head and not on the other? Because the roof was weak. The same is true for climate change. So when climate impacts come, if I am right that these targets are not going to be met, what is going to happen? What is going to happen is we're going to see the impacts of climate change. And therefore, I think the age of adaptation means is that the difference between policy, the difference between countries is going to be those who are going to be ready for this change. Right? So while on the one hand, with mitigation, we try to stop the change, but since it is now apparent that we cannot stop the change entirely, the good money is let's get ready for it and reduce its impact. देखिए यार, कराची में heat wave, मैं आपको लिख के दे सकता हूँ, आप SDC 23, SDC 24, SDC 25, SDC 26. You're going to be talking about heat waves in Karachi. Abid is here, he can put it on the permanent agenda. You can put your droughts on the permanent agenda. Therefore, the policy response ought to be, what do we do about it? Right? Heat waves are a really good example because we know what to do about it. And the good thing is, if you respond to climate impacts in countries like Pakistan, you have a development dividend. Because if you are going to do better agriculture, that is going to mean better economics. If you're going to deal with an urban environment in Karachi that is beginning to think, okay, these heat waves are no longer an aberration, Karachi will be better off. If you start to do smog policy in Lahore, that is what adaptation is. Right? If you start doing the water shortage policy, that's what adaptation policy is. So my argument on adaptation and the age of adaptation is partly coming from what I had said earlier, that now it is apparent that the impacts of climate are going to be with us. In fact, my calculations suggest in a recent paper that at this point today, there are about 2.5 billion people, 2.5 billion out of nearly 8 billion now, who are in fact in the age living in the world of adaptation, meaning that their world, they are forced to adapt. They are forced to adapt with forest fires and with sea level rise and shrimp farmers in Bangladesh. They are in Thar, they are in the mangroves in Karachi. So overall in the world, there are about 2.5 billion people. Now, this does not mean that you don't focus on mitigation. You put the heat up as much as you can on the large emitting countries. Yaar, bahut enough of your ambition, please give us some action now. And meanwhile, we focus where the impacts are on making the climate and impact resilient. What is adaptation policy? It is making climate resilience. How do you make climate resilience? You make climate resilience essentially by sustainable development. So in some ways, I think the age of adaptation is a policy opportunity for countries like us to say, let us stop the slogan buzzy and let us look at our real issues for real Pakistanis in our case, or real Indians, or real Bangladeshis, or real Nepalis, and bend the curve not simply on where the emission is going, who is emitting the carbon, But if I can just stop one, I've said too much, but one, there is an opportunity in the age of adaptation. They can, in the age of mitigation, if mitigation is the only problem, all of climate policy is essentially carbon management. Sab kuch kar kara ke na, everything that is the only thing that remains is carbon management, because climate change is because of carbon. And if you are doing carbon management, you are essentially doing energy policy, because that's where the bulk of carbon emission is coming. That is why when you see climate people, in 10 minutes, they start talking about energy. That is how it should be. Adaptation is very often about water policy. Why? Because I would argue, I have argued, written that water is to adaptation policy what energy was to mitigation policy. Why? Think about, I'll stop with this. Think about the impacts of climate. Most of them, not why climate happens, but what happens because of climate. Most of them are about water. What happens when climate changes? Water disappears, drought. Water rises, sea level rise. Water melts, glaciers. Water falls from the sky like no one's business, extreme events. Therein lies the fact that a lot of adaptation policy is going to be water-related policy. For countries like Pakistan, this is the way to own the problem, not only for now, but for what is coming in year 2, year 3, year 4. As I said, this is the permanent agenda of the SDCs.
Thank you for giving us that insight, particularly with using examples, because I think they'll resonate with the students. Let me now turn to Sobiah. Sobiah, you've been hearing this very interesting discussion. Emotional discussion, yes. And I'm just going to come back to you and have you reflect on that if you want, and then perhaps talk about how where you're sitting, what you suggest we can do in order to adapt to whatever is happening around us.
Thank you very much. And yes, I would like to reflect on what my fellow panelists have been saying. And I've been obviously listening with great curiosity and a high degree of interest. So there are one or two points that I do disagree with. I differ in my opinions, and there are others where I do agree. I think off the bat, and especially for the students sitting in the audience, it's important to underscore here that adaptation does not mean loss of livelihoods. Adaptation means having the capability or having the ability to keep your livelihoods intact in the face or in the aftermath of an extreme weather event. And this is adaptation. So you're increasing your capacity to absorb the shocks that a changing climate is bringing about. And then the second point is that, yes, putting a moratorium on new coal, which is, of course, does not take into account domestic coal that will still be used in the near future. But putting a moratorium on new coal will, I agree, probably have a negligible impact on the global carbon budget. However, where it will have an impact is on Pakistan's domestic situation, because the burning of fossil fuel has great negative impact, especially when these coal-fired power plants find themselves in the middle of agricultural heartlands. So they're going to have an impact on water availability. They're going to have an impact on food security, and they're going to have an impact on public health. And this is where this point that Dr. Najam was making links very nicely to an issue that is extremely close to my heart, is that it is time for us to stop treating the nationally determined contributions as an intangible instrument that is so far away in the future. I mean, 2030, who has seen 2030? Will we even be alive till 2030? So, it's a very intangible, mythical instrument that we have, but it's not. And I'm here to say today that the NDCs are a framework for tangible action now. And this is how we need to start approaching them. So Hassan said that a number of different actions have already been taken, and I'd like to point out here again that Pakistan submitted its first NDC in 2016 and not in 2015, and that NDC actually sees an increase in greenhouse gas emissions of up to 300% before Pakistan is going to reduce its emissions by 20%, and that is conditional to financing that it's going to get. Now, we need an NDC that is truly reflective of national circumstance, because this is what is going to prepare the country to deal with the fallout of a changing climate here and now. It's going to speak to mitigation because this is where the greatest gains can be made. And it's also going to, hopefully, going to also speak to adaptation. And it's hopefully going to be more than an academic, a highly theoretical exercise. Um, we have, with the different speakers, we've also spoken about the different extreme weather events that we've experienced, and I'm sure, I mean, you recall the devastating floods of 2010, where hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, or they lost their lives, or their livelihoods were wiped out, and some still haven't recovered from the aftermath of these floods. And as Harjeet has been very rightly pointing out, these are the sort of issues that we need to deal with, because at the end of the day, individuals are being affected, and it is the right of these individuals to have for want of a better word, I'm going to call it climate justice, but it is our right to have that for us as well as our future generations. So, do our policies and the different plans, goals that we have, do they resonate with the most vulnerable? Well, this is something that we really have to talk about, because the 2010 floods were attributed to the last La Nina oscillation. And we are now again in a La Nina oscillation. And the question that I would put to you is, how prepared are our decision makers to cope with the fallout of La Nina? Do we have social safety nets in place? Have we taken the steps to make our societies more resilient? Meaningful climate action requires a whole of government approach. It needs a whole of society approach, because climate change is cross cutting. It encompasses every spectrum of our life as we need to know it. And this is where we need to encourage and support government in examining its policy as well as its institutional frameworks to assess if the right connections are being made and if public policies and public actions are mutually reinforcing. Because without that, we're going to be lost. And it's not about global action anymore. It's not about what could be done or the promises that are being made. It's about survival now, and how are we going to best cope with that. Another point that I'd like to raise while I have the floor is that Hassan mentioned this IFC report as well. And this is a very important point, because it also links directly to the topic of this conference, which is COVID-19 recovery. So COVID is a situation that we have right now as a result of the decades of environmental degradation that we have experienced. And COVID is also inherently linked to the climate debate for very obvious reasons. And the fact that green investments have a much better return on investment than traditional investments is linked directly to the fact that climate compatible development makes economic sense. For every dollar invested in renewable energy, as an example, because I've been working with the coal metaphor, every dollar of investment there is going to yield 7 more additional jobs than it would in, for example, in traditional infrastructure or so. So it makes business sense. And as the recent World Bank report also mentioned, by investing in Renewable energy, for example, Pakistan will save $5 billion. And these are $5 billion additional dollars that the government will have to invest in social protection policies, in health, in education, and in a host of other actions which will increase the social resilience of Pakistanis and put them on a better growth trajectory. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank, thank, thank you, Sobiah, for your insights in this regard and some of the things that you think are beginning to work. I appreciated you linking social protection. We just had earlier we had a session on social protection, and social protection will definitely be important when it comes to the impacts of climate change as we move forward. So that's something that's very important. Let me now come back to Hassaan. Hassaan, you and I have been working as part of a working group with individuals from the government, individuals from the civil society, on trying to see if climate change has national security implications. Is that a way to think about what we're doing? Would that be helpful in terms of ensuring that we are taking the right steps to address this? Do we have to move, securitize climate? That's what I'm thinking. And then Sobiah mentioned a number of things that can be done via the NDCs, but with the NDCs, we haven't had an NDC that was participatory in nature. They come out at the very last moment. We haven't had a discussion around them. So how do you see us moving forward, particularly in terms of addressing these challenges?
Thank you, Imran. I want to say it was fantastic to get a little bit of a bashing from Dr. Adil and from Harjeet, but I do want to clarify a couple of points. Climate ambition, yes, 25, 30 years now almost that these things have been working since the 1992 Earth Summit. And there have been a lot of failures and a lot of learning, and that is leading to a lot of devastation and death even today, and will continue to do so into the future. That is something that we cannot go beyond. How countries, how peoples actually decide to move forward on this, and why this whole sort of politicization of climate has happened is simply because the rich feel that they can just buy their way out of the problem. And here I want to introduce the biggest national security threat that the climate actually presents. It's geoengineering. Whether you take the most sci-fi, soon to be real idea of sulfate geoengineering, or you take putting mirrors up or shades up, or you do carbon dioxide removal. The moral hazard that this presents is that rich communities, rich people, big businesses like those 100 companies feel that they can probably buy their way out of this system. It's probably also why people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are trying to put people into orbit and put people on Mars. These are contingency measures when you have the resources available to you to try and make drastic change. What's the kind of change that those 100 companies will want to make? The kind that'll get them more resources, the kind that'll create more conflict, more chaos, more resource constraints. Those are the kinds of things that capitalistic models actually thrive on. So that's the level that you're up against. That's what you're trying to raise the ambition against. And as developing countries, we have been slow on the uptake as well. We should have said, oh, we'll block this entire developed country mandate of just continuing to, push around on negotiations and not to actually reach a consensus. But the reality of our world is that we will never reach a global consensus, even if an alien invasion were to come down. Some of us would be like, no, the aliens are probably just fine. Others would side with them. So that is actually the human condition. The planet will be fine if we're gone, for sure. But as long as humans are here, we will always be fighting. We will always be conflict driven, because that is who we are as a species. And we have to try and get to a point where, philosophically speaking, the world, communities at large agree that, oh no, we are all one and the same. We have racism, we have development constraints, we have all sorts of conflicts that we do not know how to address. And the only way we actually know how to address them is through direct confrontation like war, or through negotiation processes that always fail a little bit later. World War II was not that long ago, and already the world has forgotten the devastation that that brought to the world, and all because of, in essence, inherent racism issues, slavery type issues that exist even today. These are the big questions that our communities need to contend with, and climate just happens to be the cross-cutting issue that sort of frames all of these issues very nicely. So we live in a world, the reality of this world is that we will continue to have to debate, continue to have to negotiate, continue to have to set moving benchmarks and political benchmarks as to, oh, this is what we can achieve, and then even fail to achieve those. So I really want to just say that the climate debate is one where the continual pressure and push and of young people, of older generations, all of that combined may make a change, but it may not. And that is the real lesson of the age of adaptation, is that we'll have to adapt, and there will be a lot of death, devastation, and destruction. I feel a little pessimistic saying that, but that is the reality that I think our younger generation needs to be prepared to fight for. That has to be the war footing that everybody needs to understand that we need to go on. Thank you.
Thank you, Hassaan, for contextualizing your comments in that way. And मुझे नहीं पता कि आप लोगों के पास time कितना है, क्योंकि मैं सिर्फ अपने आधे questions मेरे खत्म हुए हैं, and I would really like you guys to come back at this same time tomorrow. डॉक्टर साहब, कल आप सुबह उठ सकते हैं दोबारा 7:30 बजे? Anyways, time मेरे पास सिर्फ 1.5 घंटा था, so we gotta move on. Ambassador Shafqat Kakakhel Saab has been waiting extremely patiently, listening to all of us and listening to all of the comments here, and I'm just going to turn to him and have him give him the unenviable job of putting it all together for us and seeing कि भाई वो क्या way forward है जो हम लेके जा सकते हैं.
Can I Shafqat sir, with your permission, just half a second, make a plug. We are going to have a panel here at SDC later today. The plenary on sustainable development in the world of Corona that I'm going to be leading, which will answer some of those questions that have been asked by Kianat Bibi and others. So I wanted to plug that this conversation doesn't end. But sorry, Shafqat Saab, I took your time.
So I'm just going to give it to Shafqat Saab, and Shafqat Saab थोड़ी देर बात करेंगे, and then we'll come back to some of the questions that are coming up here. So we'll have about 10 minutes or so for that before we end. Thank you.
Thank you, Imran. Well, I'd like to first of all thank SDPI for organizing this conference. In spite of all the challenges, IT challenges and others, I appreciate that the theme of the 23rd SDC, sustainable development in the time of COVID-19. And it's only proper that day one of the SDC should have two major discussions, the discussions that we are about to conclude, and the plenary discussion in which Adil Najam will be a major participant at 8 p.m. Today, Pakistan time, to which I look forward to attending. I know all the panelists except Sobiah Becker, and I have great pleasure in welcoming her. I hope she'll be with us until COP26, and thereafter. Britain and Pakistan have had the best of relations almost throughout the past 70 years or so, And we hope that that cooperation will also extend to the area of climate change. Now, we've had very, very rich discussions, and I wouldn't attempt to summarize or to comment on the comments made. I think all the panelists who brought not only knowledge, but also commitment to the discussion. In the case of Adil Najam, his interest in environment goes back to the 1990s. The National Conservation Strategy, and then the preparations for Rio, particularly the civil society contribution to Rio, and thereafter. It's a very long story, a story of unwavering commitment to the protection of the environment in Pakistan, in South Asia, in the global South, and globally. I think panelists were quite right in expressing concern over the continued deterioration of the climate as a result of the gap between what we say we want and what we actually do. I fully share Adil Najam's frustration. It's a frustration that comes from the fact that as far as knowledge is concerned, as far as science is concerned, we've never had any deficit of that. As far back as the mid-1980s, we knew. If you read the first report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and compare it with the fifth, the only difference is of the quality and quantity of evidence. Otherwise, the conclusions as far as the drivers of climate change, the impacts of climate change, what needs to be done, the need for solidarity and international cooperation, they're all there. I remember I went to Kyoto and the European Union was talking about 15% reduction. And Al Gore kept telling the Europeans, look, I can't sell 15% to the Congress, I can sell 5%. And they agreed on 5%, and you know what happened to the 5% when he went back. And so the frustration is understandable. The main driver of climate change is the greenhouse emissions. Until 2019, they continued to increase in all countries of the world. And during this fateful year, there's been a slight reduction, maybe 5%, maybe 7%, but the curve is back on the rising sort of thing. And very soon, if and when, and I hope it is sooner rather than later, the pandemic subsides, we will go back to our habits. I think all panelists would agree that although we did not focus on the agenda, that COP26 has become crucial. We've already lost a whole year. I hope that it can be and will be held coming November in Glasgow. And I hope that as a result of the efforts made by the youth, by Greta Thunberg and others, by the scientists, there will be a genuine increase in ambition. And there are some positive indication. China has, for the first time, recently committed itself to go carbon neutral by 2060. And it is quite possible that, given what we have all seen, I've been visiting China, and in Beijing and in most major cities, most of the public transport now comprises electrified vehicles, electric vehicles. And there is a discernible, palpable difference in the air and all, that it is quite possible that they will bring this forward, the target of going neutral. There have been hopeful signs even from ExxonMobil. They are talking about not increasing their fossil fuel commitments. It seems that when it comes to mitigation, it's essentially a battle for clean energy, to reduce the greenhouse gas. And there has been a drop in the price. And today, if you take globally, renewable energy is the cheapest energy. But when I look at the situation in Pakistan, and I refer to Prime Minister Imran Khan's speech, by the way, it is a good speech. He promised a nature-based approach. He talked about the 10 billion trees. He talked about increasing the protected areas from 9 to 15. He talked about the target of 60% of our power coming from renewable energy. And we have a new alternative and renewable energy development policy, which was actually finalized last year, but formally adopted this year, which makes a huge change in the whole process of inviting tenders, inviting bids for wind and solar. But when it comes to the challenges, Pakistan does not produce any of the essential equipment for solar energy or wind energy. We don't produce the turbines. We don't produce the panels. We don't produce the batteries. So as far as Pakistan is concerned, it will not be the cheapest. So there are challenges, and but still, I hope that Glasgow will be held on time, and Glasgow will pick up the thread from where it was left off in Katowice. If we recall the outcome of the Katowice COP24, it finished most of the work from Paris in terms of the rule book, but it left fundamental issues between particularly those of concern to developing countries unresolved. Whether it is mitigation, whether it is adaptation, the developed countries refuse to commit any funds, even in finance. In finance, there has been no clear commitment that the $100 billion will come from public sources. And we don't know. We don't know how will COVID-19 impact, given that the first and foremost priority of all the countries, whether developed or developing, in now, this year, next year, and in the next decade, will be on undoing the negative consequences of COVID-19. I think, and let's hope that we are coming to an end, because we are not. I mean, this whole question of vaccine nationalism and vaccine apartheid, it's a very real situation. If you read, the Amnesty International has given us details of how the developed countries, about a dozen or so, have basically booked all the vaccines that are being produced. So as far as Pakistan is concerned, we've had a number of positive developments, the ones that the Prime Minister talked about, and some others. In 2017, the Parliament approved the climate bill, which actually addressed the institutional deficiencies and inadequacies in the country by creating not only the Climate Council as an apex body for policy deliberations, but also the Climate Change Authority. Because now the Prime Minister talks about all these things. Who is going to do all the work required for translating the nature-based approach into practical, tangible measures? The small, ill-resourced, ill-equipped Ministry of Climate Change. I have all my sympathy for the Ministry of Climate Change, particularly for the advisor, Malik Amin Aslam, civil society, which I now support and am a part of, welcomed his appointment, but there has been no increase in the resources of the Ministry of Climate Change. There has been no action on the operationalization of the climate law of 2017. Similarly, in 2018, just before the Nawaz Sharif government went, and we had a national policy on water resources. Adil Najam in passing mentioned, as far as Pakistan is concerned, all the impacts of climate change will essentially, be demonstrated in the water sector of Pakistan, whether it is sea level rise, whether it is extreme events, floods, or droughts, whether it's increase in temperature, all of them, whether it's the rapid melting of the glaciers, which provide 65% of the water to all the surface water to Pakistan. All these basically relate to the water sector, and that is why I agree with my friend Sunita Narayan of the Center for Science and Environment in New Delhi. Let's make water our single most pressing obsession. There are the issues that were left unresolved in Katowice and could not be resolved in Madrid. We have a formidable job ahead of us. I wish Mr. Alok Sharma and colleagues in the Sobiah, Becker's colleagues and French officials and European, and my own colleagues in the developing world, I hope we can find solutions to all those issues, but those issues are very, very serious. Paris was a compromise. And as is natural in all the compromises, you leave certain holes in the hope that subsequently those can be plugged. So let's hope that in Glasgow, much before the Glasgow, this pandemic subsides and consultations are held to resolve the pending issues so that we can genuinely, 2022, can see full action. 1.5 is likely to be achieved much, much earlier than the scheduled time, because according to the World Meteorological Organization, we've reached 1.2. And given the increase in emissions and the trend of global warming, there is a 20% chance that we will reach 1.5 in 2024.
Thank
so
you.
it's a long, long discussion. And once again, I'd like to thank all the panelists for their tremendous contributions. I think we are, if anything, today we know after this session, I personally know more than I did before I switched on for this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kakakhel Saab, eloquent as ever. Thank you for your comments. Before we conclude, I know there have been some questions that the panelists have seen. I'm just going to come to them. We're running over time, but just in a few minutes, if I may ask everyone to take a minute each to just give their final views, be they in response to a question or in general, and we can conclude the session. May I please start with Harjeet Singh? I know he has a meeting to go to, and appreciate him staying a little bit over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's always a pleasure to hear Ambassador Kakakhel Saab and the way you connected all these issues, and these are important, particularly including connecting climate with the COVID crisis that we are facing. Very quickly from my side, something that we have been saying for a very long time, and this is also particularly for the interest of Dr. Najam, we have been saying system change, not climate change. So we have to stop looking at climate change from a very environmental perspective. It's a system that is responsible for the crisis, and that's what we really have to attack. And I also cannot agree more that while we have to keep the focus at the international level on mitigation, we also have to talk much more about adaptation in our own countries. And as developing countries, we have not done enough. In fact, we are working on the issue of climate-induced migration with SDPI and in a number of other countries, and we will be talking more about it on 16th as part of SDC at 11:30 Pakistan time, because migration itself indicates that our coping mechanisms have failed. We have not adapted, and that's why people are being forced to move. So there's a lot that needs to be done to make sure that people can stay, and if at all they have to move because it's inevitable, they move with dignity. So there's a lot that needs to happen, and climate should also be seen as a justice issue, whether we talk about between poor countries and rich countries, or even in our own countries between the elites and poor population. So there's a lot that needs to happen, and as developing countries, we are really lagging behind, and we have to connect the issue of climate with development much more in a much more integral manner. Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to this August panel and giving a chance to interact. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Sobiah, briefly, please.
Thank you very, very much. And especially a big thank you to Ambassador Kakakhel for the very warm welcome. And I look forward to interacting with you, Mr. Kakakhel, in the near future as well. A fantastic panel. There were many insights that I appreciated, and I think in in an intellectual environment such as this one can always agree to disagree. I think that my main message to the students in the audience, because they are really our future, is that think rationally, come up with very well considered, well rounded argumentation, and inform yourself. Inform yourself about the developments, inform yourself about the facts, and just know what's going on in a rational, scientifically grounded approach. The second big message is that is the old management mantra: what gets measured gets managed. And I think this is no different for the discussion that we're having here. We need to know the intensity of our emissions. We need to understand what the sources are, and then we need to understand how we're going to address them, because when we can address them, then we will be able to address many other problems that are coming up. And these problems uh, uh, run the spectrum all the way from public health to security issues. And I'm very happy that some of my colleagues did also bring up the security issues, because climate insecurity will lead to conflict as well, and these are deeply intertwined. So, climate, migration, and conflict are deeply intertwined. And these are things we need to start doing now. We can't afford to postpone climate action. We are all responsible, and we all need to get into this. And then finally, I'd like to close my comments by saying that what we need to also focus on is just transition. So we need to ensure a just transition for our society and for equitable outcomes for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sobiah. Hassan?
Thank you, Imran, and thank you, Ambassador Kakakhel, for those wonderful closing remarks. Quickly, in order for you to make a change in any which way, you should try and think holistically and sustainably. In any field you go into, it does not matter if it's business, if it's medical, there is, or even if it's environment and climate, there is always a case to be made for how to live well, how to live efficiently, and how to live within the confines of the resources and the closed system we have on Earth. If you put that thought to everything you do, you will find that the world can be made a better place. And in order to do so, you have to not only do that for yourself, but you have to fight and you have to preach. So, go do exactly that. Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan. And last but not least, Dr. Najam. And I've been looking for a background, for my Zoom, and I think I found it. So thank you for that as well.
If you have to look like this, then you have to eat like that. Thank you to everyone. Thank you, everyone. And again, my apologies for maybe becoming too passionate about this, but I would like to plug again that we have continuation of this conversation now, not just today, but every day at this conference. So this is only day one. Please stay engaged. Today at 8 p.m., I will be hosting what we are calling a planetary with some of the finest people I know on sustainable development and COVID. And there were a few questions that were asked. We will take them up there. COVID, is it going to be a bane or a boom? Maybe we will realize through this what a global crisis looks like. Because climate change की कोई vaccine नहीं है. COVID still can get a vaccine. Climate change is not going to get solved by slogans. It's going to be solved by actions. And I'll have Yolanda Kakabat, the former Minister of Environment of Ecuador, President of IUCN, Alice Rueza, the head of WWF Africa, Sakiko Fukadapar, who is the head of the Human Development Report, or was the head of the Human Development Report Office, and Sunita Narayan, my dear friend, who's the head of Center for Science and Environment. So इससे बेहतर लोग मुझे नहीं मिल सकते. Please join us for that. In terms of Glasgow, please put a lot of attention on what Kakakhel Saab said. Each of these, despite what I said, each of these opportunities is a very, very expensive opportunity to move. Expensive कहने का मतलब ये नहीं है कि don't do it. Expensive कहने का मतलब ये है कि the amount of effort and cost and time that goes into this, if it is only going to become a junket and a talk fest, is a tremendous waste. I have a 2-point agenda on Glasgow, the A and the A. The first A is, please spare me. No need for ambition. Keep your ambition. Give me action. We as civil society, we as scholars need to hold the country, especially the big countries, responsible. It's been 5 years. What have you done? Please tell us. Don't tell us what you'll do in the next 10 years because we were listening to that for 25. Hold them to fire. It's a very simple question. You have 5 years. You said in NDCs, you will do this. Let us bring a report. When my kid goes to school, he gets a report at the end of the year of what he had done, not what he will do in the next year. Let us hold the big countries to that. That is item 1 for Glasgow. If Glasgow does that, it is going to be real. If it doesn't do that, it's a joke. Second, Zegam Habib had a number of very good comments on that, as did other on your comments. The adaptation part, as I'm saying, but particularly for countries like us, that means agriculture. And I would say for a lot of countries. So let us bring climate home to let us prepare for its impacts. Let us learn from COVID. It is better to be prepared for a crisis beforehand rather than going and hiding in your home afterwards. So it is exactly like that. And we should be focusing and say, here, Glasgow, now you need to give us a real adaptation agenda, because an adaptation agenda, by definition, will be a development agenda. I wish you all the very, very best. And thank you, Imran, and all of SDPI for a wonderful conversation. And thank you to my panelists. Colleagues.
Thank you so much, colleagues and panelists, for joining us. It's been a wonderful session, but the conference is just beginning. So there are a number of panels that are happening tomorrow, day after, going on till the 17th. If you're interested in environment, in climate change, we're having one on migration. We're having one on urban water governance. We're having one on water sanitation and hygiene. We're having some on SDGs. So we're running the gamut here. So thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. And please do join us in about 15 minutes to have Dr. Adil Najam and see him lead the planetary. Thank you so much.